For me, my favourite collections of documents are these 8 volumes of Daniel O'Connell correspondence, and they cover 5 decades of Irish history, going from 1792 until his death in 1847. And for me, history really isn't about heroes and villains. It's about real people, the lives they lead, the decisions they make, the obstacles they encounter along the way. And that's what you get in these 8 volumes. It's 3,500 letters to Daniel O'Connell, from Daniel O'Connell. And it's not just from Daniel O'Connell's perspective. It's not Daniel O'Connell as the hero in his own story, because we get an insight into the bad side as well, the vanity, some of the political skullduggery, some of the financial mismanagement and perhaps corruption. So it's a wide-ranging account of life, politics, society, religion from the 1790s all the way up to the middle of the famine and the worst year of the famine. And you get the greatness of O'Connell here, the young man starting out facing Catholic restrictions because of his faith, struggling to make his way as a barrister, the insecurity, the doubts there, and then his extraordinary political achievement, the winning of Catholic emancipation, which I think should really probably be called civil rights, because that's what it was, that's what it meant for the people of Ireland in the 1820s. And doing it through leading a mass constitutional nationalist peaceful movement. And that made headlines around the world. And I think what's so brilliant in these volumes is they're also beautifully annotated by Maurice O'Connell. A huge amount of work went into these volumes. They were published between 1972 and 1980, and for every single letter you've got annotations and footnotes explaining who the cast of characters are, what's going on, where these letters may have been published. They might have been private letters or public letters, giving you extracts from the Dublin and London newspapers of the day. So it provides the context as well. I use them for my teaching. I teach a module in Trinity on Ireland in the age of O'Connell. They're fundamental to it, but also in my wider work on Ireland in the 18th and the 19th century, because we're not just getting an insight into the Act of Union or the passing of emancipation. You also get an insight into Daniel O'Connell's campaign against slavery, which again made headlines in the United States and around the world in the 1830s and in the 1840s. You also get some of the people writing to O'Connell because they feel he has betrayed them politically. They might feel that he has money resting in his account that shouldn't be resting there, and some of the other problems. So it's not just a one-sided pro-O'Connell account that you get in these 8 volumes. It's something very different. And I have a few extracts that I picked that give you, I think, a good sense of the brilliance of these letters. The best time in these letters is when Daniel O'Connell was away from his wife, because a lot of the letters are to his wife. And these are letters from April 1829, when O'Connell had won his seat in Clare the year before and was now in London to watch the Catholic Emancipation Relief Act pass through the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And we see him writing to his wife once, maybe twice, 3 times a day, sharing his excitement, sharing his passion about what was happening. And he talks about here on the 11th of April 1829 about how the bill has passed the House of Lords, and he says that she will now have ascendancy over those neighbours who before that had a proud superiority over her at the end of the day. And was it not your husband who contributed most to this measure? Was it not sweetest? And then on the 13th of April, he writes to her about how the day has at length arrived, the royal assent has been given. And then the very next day, the 14th of April, he dates it the first day of freedom. And that's what the passing of emancipation meant to O'Connell. It was the first day of freedom. And that's what it meant to so many people in Ireland in the 1820s. Daniel O'Connell always said that you could walk down any street in Ireland and you could tell the Catholics by the way they walked. They wouldn't make eye contact with you. Their posture was bad. They would shuffle, look at the ground because they felt inferior. And what we see in these volumes is how Daniel O'Connell made them believe that they were equal citizens in their own country. And then by leading this mass peaceful movement, he won them their freedom. You also, of course, see the vanity then of O'Connell, how he would love to travel around in the 1830s and ask children if they knew who he was. And if they didn't, he'd say, "I'm the man who won you your freedom." We see how he is awarded the name Liberator, the name by which he is known in Ireland today. But it was very much a real liberation in 1828 and 1829, because it was winning something that had been denied to the Irish people for so long. And these volumes are the best account of the daily, day-by-day struggle to do that. The meetings of the Catholic Association in the 1820s, when only 4 or 5 people would attend, until finally, by the end of the decade, you had hundreds and thousands of people joining the movement. So it's a story of failure, it's a story of despair, it's a story of struggling against overwhelming odds, and it's a story of great victories and triumph. And then all the way running through it, you have that extraordinary personal touch. The letters to his wife, the discussions about his children, the letters to his friends. You see the fallings out with friends and political colleagues. You see the reconciliations. So it's very much a human story. It's not a perfect story by any means. It's not airbrushing out the criticisms and the faults and the failures. That's all here in these volumes. So you get a very real rounded portrait of a man who was one of the greatest figures in Irish history, but by no means a perfect figure. Someone who, as I say, was involved in various kinds of skullduggery as well, who could be ruthless, who could be vain, who could be very aggressive towards his enemies, and sometimes very aggressive towards his friends. Here in 1835, we have a correspondence with Alexander Raphael, who was a rich banker in London. Daniel O'Connell sold him a seat in Parliament in Ireland. And then when it all fell through, Daniel O'Connell went radio silent. But we do have the letters from Alexander Raphael to him. And it was a major political scandal of the day. And it led to a major political investigation, and an investigation in the House of Commons in Westminster. And Daniel O'Connell probably would have been prosecuted, probably would have lost his seat, and probably would have been disgraced in the 1830s, only for the fact that he was in a political alliance with the Whigs. We might say today that he was too big to fail. So you very much get the failures and the darker side of O'Connell. It's not hidden in the volumes. It's all there in black and white, and it's all beautifully annotated by the editor. And that's why I think you get an insight if you're writing about how elections were conducted in Ireland, how mass movements, the role of women in these movements is very much here in the documents as well. You get a great insight into personal and family life. We get an insight into the religious divisions in the island, the tensions between Catholics and Protestants, the way some of those tensions became worse in the 1830s. And we see Daniel O'Connell's concern about those growing tensions and his attempts to make them less, and indeed his failures. And of course the volumes end with heartbreak. They end with failure. They end with the outbreak of the famine. And here we see Daniel O'Connell in absolute despair. His wife is already dead. He's brokenhearted. He knows he's dying. And in every single one of these letters, it's about him trying to save the Irish people during the famine, and all the way leading up to his final speech in the House of Commons in 1847 in February, where he pleads for the life of the Irish people, and then his heartbreaking final journey to Rome, where he dies on the way at Genoa. So it very much captures the trauma of Ireland during these decades, the trauma of the penal laws in the first volumes, the success and triumph of the civil rights being achieved, and then the huge campaign for repeal. But then it ends in despair and heartbreak as well. So there's a cinematic quality to these volumes. Every single volume is a movie, and students always love dipping in and out of the volumes because there's all kinds of life here. They are all these individual movies, and they're movies really about the story of Ireland as much about the story of O'Connell. And that's why, for all his faults, for all his failings, for all the vanity, for all the arrogance, for all the ego, there is a political genius at work here. There was someone who dedicated his life to liberating the Irish people, and that's why now, even so many years on in the 21st century, Daniel O'Connell deserves that reputation as the Irish chieftain, as the Irish leader, and yes, even as the Irish liberator. I think the Irish Manuscripts Commission did the world a great service with these volumes. The editor, Maurice O'Connell, but also there was a great team, Gerald Line, so many were involved in helping to put them together. I think it was an extraordinary achievement. And the thing that I can't really understand is how they were published in such a short period, that in a pre-internet age, when everything had to be studied by looking at the original letters, newspapers, documents, the amount of work that went into transcribing them, reading the handwriting, but then annotating them and finding out all of these corresponding documents, I actually find it extraordinary.